This video is created for informational purposes only. Everyone mentioned is treated with respect, and no harm or disrespect is intended. Viewer discretion is advised.
Thank you so much for coming out here with me, Christopher.
I'm having a wonderful time. You mean a lot to me, and I'm glad you're having a blast. I'm so out of breath.
On August 13th, 2018, in a quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado, a family of 4 vanished. What seemed like a horrible tragedy, a missing pregnant wife, 2 young children, would soon become one of America's most watched murder cases. But for years afterward, while Chris Watts sat in his prison cell, something unexpected happened. He began confiding, not to attorneys, not to therapists, but to the man living in the cell directly next to him. That man's name was Tallman. And according to Tallman's account, Chris Watts revealed details about what really happened that night, details that point an accusatory finger directly at the woman he was having an affair with, not just as a mistress, not just as a complication, but as someone whose demands and ultimatum, according to Watts himself, set everything in motion. This is the story that nobody wanted to believe, the story that a convicted murderer, trapped in a Wisconsin prison, decided to share with someone who would eventually tell the world. And what he allegedly said about Nichol Kessinger challenges everything we thought we knew about that August night in 2018. Today, we're examining allegations that have emerged from Tallman's accounts based on his time as Chris Watts' neighboring inmate at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. According to public records and media reports, Watts allegedly confessed to Tallman through conversations and correspondence that Nichol Kessinger gave him an ultimatum the night before the murders: choose her or keep his family. What Watts allegedly said about Kessinger paints a very different picture than the one the public saw in 2018. A picture where Kessinger wasn't a passive participant in the affair, but someone whose demands were directly connected to the events that followed. Now, I need to be clear from the start. These are allegations from a convicted murderer. No new physical evidence has emerged. No charges have been filed against Nichol Kessinger. She was never arrested, never prosecuted, and officially cleared by investigators. What we're examining today comes from Tallman's published accounts and media reports, and nothing here should be mistaken for proof of guilt. But the story itself is significant, and it's worth understanding exactly what Watts allegedly said, and why people are listening. Welcome back, and today we're walking through one of the most compelling questions surrounding the Watts family murders. What role did Nichol Kessinger actually play in the events leading up to August 13th, 2018? By the end of this episode, you'll have a complete picture of what Tallman claims Chris Watts told him, and you'll be able to form your own conclusions about what actually happened. Let's start where this story actually begins briefly. Not in a prison cell, but in a home that looked, from the outside, like the American dream, and to remember the victims as wonderful people and not as characters in a true crime story. It all began in Frederick, Colorado, the kind of neighborhood where families wave at each other on Saturday mornings, where kids play in yards that back onto fields, and where social media profiles are filled with the kind of moments that make other people smile and feel like they're missing something. This was the Watts family home at Saratoga Trail. Shannann Watts, 34 years old, was a health and wellness consultant, driven, ambitious, the kind of woman who built a thriving business through social media, who posted videos of her family's moments, her daughters Bella and Celeste, then 4 and 3 years old, playing together, laughing, being read bedtime stories by their father. In 2018, Shannann discovered she was 15 weeks pregnant. A son, Nico. The family was complete, or soon would be. Chris Watts, 33, worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. On the surface, he was the supporting husband, quieter than Shannann, but present. He attended his daughter's activities. He worked steadily. The family appeared stable. Not perfect, no family is, but stable, real. Nichol Kessinger entered this equation in the summer of 2018. She was 30 years old, a geologist at Anadarko Petroleum where Chris worked. According to what Chris told investigators, They met at work. Then they ran into each other a few times around the office. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that seemed like it would become a story that would be told and retold for years. But by July 2018, something had shifted. The encounters between Chris and Nichole became more frequent. And by early August, just weeks before the murders, things had intensified considerably. This is where the moral weight of this story begins to bear down. In the background of Shannann's pregnancy posts, her excited videos about becoming a mother of 3, something was corroding. Trust was being violated. A marriage was crumbling while the wife believed they were building something together. Early in the morning on August 13, 2018, Shannann Watts arrived home late from a work trip. She'd been in Arizona attending a business event. The doorbell camera captured her arrival, tired, carrying a bag, moving through the familiar routines of coming home. Inside the house, her husband was already there. By morning, Shannann, Bella, and Celeste were gone. A friend, alerted by Shannann's absence from a scheduled meeting and her failure to respond to messages, called for a welfare check. Police arrived at the Saratoga Trail address. Chris reported his family missing. He appeared on camera pleading for their return, his face the mask of a confused and terrified husband. What followed was one of the most intensive investigations in Colorado history. Within days, bodies were discovered at an oil field where Chris worked. Shannann was found in an oil tank. Her daughters were discovered separately. The unborn Nico did not survive. Chris Watts confessed, not initially to the complete truth. First, he told investigators that Shannann had killed their daughters in a fit of rage and that he had killed her in response. This version lasted only as long as police surveillance lasted. Under pressure, confronted with evidence, he changed his story. He confessed to all 4 murders. He pleaded guilty. But during all of this, through the interviews, the confessions, the guilty plea in November 2018, one person stood conspicuously to the side: Nichol Kessinger. She cooperated with investigators. She provided timelines. She admitted the affair. She described her shock when she learned what had happened. And then she largely disappeared from public view. For 6 years, that was the story. Case closed. Mystery solved. A man murdered his family. The mistress was collateral damage, a woman caught in the wake of a man's depravity. But then, in 2024, something changed. Tallman was convicted on drug-related charges and imprisoned at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. At some point during his incarceration, he became neighbors with Chris Watts. According to Tallman's own account, the two bonded over shared interests. They became close. For approximately 10 months they lived in neighboring cells, and according to Tallman's published accounts, Watts poured out his thoughts during this time through conversations and correspondence. What he allegedly said about Nichol Kessinger was damning. According to media reports of Tallman's accounts, Watts began characterizing Kessinger in biblical terms. He called her a Jezebel, a H-lot. He wrote about how her flattering speech was like drops of honey that had seduced him. He allegedly told Tallman that the night before the murders, Kessinger had issued an ultimatum: choose her or keep his family. This is the crucial claim. This is the allegation that, if true, would reframe everything about what happened on August 13, 2018. According to Watts's alleged statements to Tallman, Watts was trapped between two women. He was in love with both, by his own admission. And Kessinger, knowing this, forced his hand. She made him choose. What makes this claim so important is that it suggests Kessinger wasn't a passive third party in a tragedy. It suggests she was an active force driving events toward a breaking point. In one alleged statement, Watts told Tallman that the words of have brought me low. All her guests were in the chamber of death. The biblical reference is unmistakable. He was implying that Kessinger's influence, her pressure, her ultimatum had played a role in what was to come. Tallman published these accounts in his book series, which came out in 2024. According to Tallman's description, the books are based on his 10 months of direct interaction with Watts in neighboring cells. First-hand accounts, direct from the source. And when these allegations emerged, a conversation that had seemingly ended in 2018 suddenly reopened. Here's where we have to be careful about the human dimension of this. Chris Watts murdered 4 people. That is the central, irreducible fact. Nothing Kessinger allegedly did, nothing she allegedly said, can remove his agency or his responsibility. Murder is a choice. It's a profound moral rupture. But the question Tallman's accounts raise is this: did she accelerate events toward that rupture? Did she create pressure that helped push a man toward his worst impulses? That's a different question from asking whether she's guilty of murder. And it's a question that's worth examining. Let's walk through what we know, chronologically, from verified sources. July 2018. Chris Watts's affair with Nichol Kessinger intensifies. They work together at Anadarko Petroleum. According to investigators, this is when physical intimacy began, though the exact timeline has been disputed. Text messages and phone records show increased communication between them. Early August 2018, the situation becomes more visible. Text records, which were part of discovery documents released after the case concluded, show increased contact. According to available records, Kessinger sends messages to Chris asking about his relationship status and whether he would be getting a divorce. August 12, 2018. According to Dylan Tallman's account of Watts' statements, this is the night when the critical conversation allegedly occurred. Kessinger allegedly called Chris. The conversation was intense. She demanded he choose. Watts was torn. He was trapped between 2 lives. Something had to give. August 13, 2018. The murders occur. Now, regarding the physical evidence, and this is where things become important to understand, there is no forensic evidence that connects Nichol Kessinger to the murders themselves. No fingerprints, no DNA, no direct evidence of her involvement in the actual act of violence. She was not present at the scene. She did not handle the bodies. She did not dispose of them. What exists is circumstantial. Her Google search history, which became part of discovery documents, showed searches related to relationships and divorce. These searches occurred before the murders. They suggest she was thinking about her relationship with Chris and what the future might hold. After the murders, Kessinger deleted text messages. This fact has been noted by some as consciousness of guilt, a desire to distance herself from involvement. But it can also be interpreted as a woman who realized she was caught up in something horrible and wanted to separate herself from it. Here's what's crucial. Kessinger cooperated fully with investigators in 2018. She gave interviews. She provided timelines. She admitted the affair. She answered their questions. If investigators believed she had knowledge of the murders or involvement in them, she would have been charged. She wasn't. But Tallman's accounts introduce a possibility. They suggest that what Kessinger said to police in 2018 and what she actually knew or intended might be 2 different things. They suggest that her influence on Chris was deeper and more calculated than she admitted. When you examine this case closely, contradictions emerge. And contradictions are where questions begin to multiply. Let's start with Kessinger's own statements to police in 2018. In recorded interviews, she described shock at learning what Chris had done. She said she believed he was planning to separate from Shannann. They would divorce amicably. He would see his daughters. Life would restructure, but no one would die. But her text messages tell a different story. In discovery documents, Kessinger is shown directly asking Chris whether he's going to get a divorce. This isn't the question of a woman confident in a man's commitment to leave his wife. It's the question of a woman applying pressure, demanding clarity, making it real. And then there's the conversation Watts allegedly described to Tallman, the August 12th phone call. According to Tallman's account, this is where things came to a head. According to what Watts allegedly told Tallman, Kessinger made demands. She forced a choice. Watts was caught between 2 lives, unable to have both. The counter-argument is obvious and important. We're taking the word of a convicted murderer. Chris Watts has every motivation to minimize his own responsibility. Shifting blame to Kessinger is convenient. It's a narrative that makes him less of a monster in his own mind. It's the story a man tells himself to make his own actions survivable, psychologically. And there's precedent for this. In his initial confession, Watts blamed Shannann. He said she killed the daughters. Later, he admitted that was a lie. So why should we believe anything he says about Kessinger? That's a legitimate question, and it's one we should keep in mind as we consider these allegations. But here's what matters. We have text messages from Kessinger to Chris asking directly about divorce. We have her search history showing she was thinking about relationships and the future. We have Watts' alleged statements to Tallman that she applied pressure. None of this is proof of guilt, but all of it suggests the story was more complex than a simple affair. And this brings us to perhaps the most unsettling question in this entire story. What if Nichol Kessinger didn't just have an affair with Chris Watts? What if she actively created the pressure that led to everything that followed? This isn't a question about her legal guilt. She's not guilty by law, but it's a question about her role in the events of that night, about whether she bears some responsibility for creating an impossible situation, for making demands that had catastrophic consequences. Think about it. A man trapped between two lives, a woman demanding he choose, a pregnant wife at home, two young children, a demand with no compromise available. Some people will look at Tallman's accounts and see them as a murderer's attempt to rewrite history and escape responsibility. They'll argue that Watts is simply inventing a narrative to make himself feel less monstrous, and they have a point. Other people will look at the text messages, at the timeline, at Watts's alleged statements, and they'll see a woman who was actively pushing for an outcome, who was willing to destroy a family to have what she wanted, who applied pressure that had irreversible consequences. The truth is that we don't know for certain, but we should be asking the question. If you're following along with us, and if this story is making you think, I'd ask that you subscribe to the channel right now. We cover true crime cases with nuance and accuracy, and we're constantly examining new angles on stories you thought you knew. Subscribe now, and you won't miss a single episode. Dylan Tallman's accounts present something important. They don't just relay allegations, they present a perspective from someone who spent 10 months living directly next to Chris Watts, someone who heard his voice every day, someone who claims to have access to a window into his thinking that no one else has. According to Tallman's published accounts, Watts moved through several emotional states during their time as neighbors. First was deflection. Watts tried to frame the murders as something other than a calculated act. The story shifted, first blaming Shannann, then framing it differently. But as time passed, and as Tallman and Watts developed their relationship, Tallman claims that Watts began to acknowledge a different truth, that the affair was at the root of everything, that Kessinger's presence in his life had changed him, that her demands had cornered him. In the statements Tallman has published, Watts allegedly wrote about being seduced by Kessinger. He used language that suggests she was the temptress and he was trapped by temptation. He referenced scripture, presenting a narrative where Kessinger was an active agent of influence and where his responsibility was complicated by her role. Now here's what matters about this choice of narrative. It's not random. Watts isn't just describing an affair. He's constructing a story where Kessinger bears some of the moral weight. It's a very old story, one that goes back centuries to the idea of woman as temptress and man as victim of temptation. Whether this narrative is true or whether it's a convenient fiction Watts constructed to survive his own guilt is the question that has divided people who follow this case closely. And here's what sits at the center of that division. If Kessinger was actively creating the conditions that led to violence, that's one kind of story. It's a story about calculated pressure and willingness to destroy a family for personal gain. But if Watts is simply reframing his own choices as her fault, then that's a different story. That's a story about a man refusing to own his actions. That's a man finding a scapegoat for his own moral failure. Both interpretations are dark. Neither absolves Watts of responsibility for murder, but they paint very different pictures of who Nichol Kessinger is as a person and what role she played in the events of August 13, 2018. Let's talk about what we know happened to the people involved in this story after August 13, 2018. Chris Watts. He pleaded guilty to all charges in November 2018. He received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. This is his permanent reality. Nichol Kessinger. She was never charged with any crime. She was never arrested. She cooperated fully with investigators and was cleared of any involvement in the murders. She did not assist in planning them. She did not know about them before they happened. By law, she is innocent. Officially, she is clear. What happened after is less documented publicly. She received significant online harassment and threats from members of the public. Her life was fundamentally altered by her association with this case. Tallman. He was imprisoned on drug-related charges. He claims to have formed a close relationship with Chris Watts while imprisoned. When that relationship changed, Tallman published accounts of what Watts allegedly told him. These accounts were released in 2024 and have generated significant media attention and public discussion. Shannann, Watts, Bella, Celeste, and Nichole. Sadly, they're no longer with us. They were murdered on August 13, 2018. Their families have spoken publicly about the devastation of losing them. Shannann's mother, Sandra Razuchek, has been a consistent presence in media surrounding this case, advocating for her daughter's memory. The case remains one of the most watched true crime stories in recent American history. The community of Frederick, Colorado has carried the trauma of this case for nearly 7 years. The neighborhood became a site of significant public interest. The case continues to be studied, discussed, and debated. Nothing in Tallman's accounts, nothing in Watts' alleged confessions changes that fundamental fact. These allegations don't justify the murders. They don't explain them away. They don't make them acceptable. What they do is complicate our understanding of how the tragedy unfolded. They suggest that while Watts pulled the trigger, he didn't act in a vacuum. There were conditions that led to it. There were choices made by multiple people that created a situation where tragedy became possible. That doesn't absolve Watts, but it does invite us to think carefully about the role that Kessinger played in creating those conditions. So what do we do with this information? The investigation is closed. Chris Watts is in prison for life. Nichol Kessinger is officially cleared. There's no new trial coming. There's no legal reckoning pending. What remains is a question that each of us has to answer for ourselves. Given what we know, not just about the murders, but about the affair, the pressure, the alleged ultimatum, how do we understand the role that different people played in this tragedy? Some people will look at Tallman's accounts and see them as a murderer's attempt to rewrite history and escape responsibility. They'll argue that Watts is simply inventing a narrative to make himself feel less monstrous, and they have a credible point. Other people will look at the timeline, at the text messages, at Watts' alleged statements, and they'll see a woman who was actively pushing for an outcome, who was willing to destroy a family, who applied pressure that had irreversible consequences. The truth is that we don't have all the answers, and we probably never will. What I know is this: the Watts family murders remain one of the most important reminders that families can contain secrets, that people can appear functional and stable while chaos is unfolding beneath the surface, that pressure and desire can lead people to choices they never thought they'd make, and that sometimes the stories we think we understand completely have more to them than we initially realized. Thank you for watching. If this story has stayed with you, if you find yourself turning it over in your mind, thinking about the questions it raises, I want you to subscribe to our channel right now. We explore true crime narratives with honesty and care, and we don't shy away from the difficult questions these cases raise. Subscribe and make sure you're notified when we release our next investigation. And more importantly, I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me what you think. Do you believe Tallman's accounts of Watts' confessions? Do you think Nichol Kessinger bears any responsibility for what happened? Or do you see her as primarily a victim of circumstance? Do you think Watts is being truthful about his motivations, or do you believe he's rewriting his own history? Comment below. Seriously, take a moment and share your thoughts, because these questions matter. They matter to how we understand power, influence, and responsibility in relationships. They matter to how we think about justice, complicity, and the things we choose to do and not do. Tell us what you think in the comments. Subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. And join us next time as we continue exploring the stories that America keeps telling itself about crime, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the doors of ordinary homes. Thank you for watching.